Welcome. I'm Professor Kevin Sharp from the Department of Philosophy here. I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement, a reminder that we're on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskiyia, Pinkashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Misaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw Nation lands that were the traditional territory of Native nations prior to their forced removal. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. In light of this, we must strive to become a vibrant community inclusive of all of our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. Before I proceed with the introduction of tonight's speaker, I'd like to remind you that the MCT next week will be Zuza Giel from Sociology and Lou Turner from Urban and Regional Planning on the subject of Marxism. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing Sebastian Rand, Associate Professor in Philosophy at Georgia State University, where he also holds an appointment in the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics. His work focuses on major figures of German idealism, especially Hegel, and their attempts to understand the goals, methods, and results of the natural sciences, both on their own and in relation to other areas of philosophy and culture more generally. His publications include numerous articles, book chapters, and critical reviews, and in addition, an edited volume, Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Critical Perspectives on Freedom and History, from Routledge in 2022, and a translation of Catherine Marabou from 2004. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rand.
Thank you, Kevin. And thanks as well to the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory, to Dee Ruggles, Shelley Weinberg, Tai Wakabayashi, and John Bernard, who coordinated things so as to include me and get me here for this series. I know that for various reasons, not all of them could be here for the session today, but I'm grateful to them, delighted to be here, and grateful to all of you who were able to make it. What I'm going to say to you today will come, surprise, surprise, in three main parts, and because the speculative concept sometimes also comes in fours, a fourth part. In the first part, I'll tell you my way to my topical focus in Hegel. In the second, I'll lay out what I think Hegel is doing in the area I focus on. And in the third, I'll discuss the basic program animating, to some degree or other, what has been for the last few decades and remains still the most fruitful and active line of work on Hegel's thought. And then, assuming we have time in the fourth part, I will make a few suggestions about ways forward or around or through or beside in relation to Hegel and current criticism and interpretive theory. So let me start by giving you a sense of where I'm coming from in my own work. That is a sense of what, as someone working on Hegel in the early 21st century, I take to be a fruitful line for something beyond straightforward scholarly historical erudition, a fruitful line for philosophical theoretical inquiry and development. The main focus of my work is Hegel's philosophy of nature, and in particular his treatment of mechanics and the conception of mathematics that informs that treatment. This can seem like a wholly normal kind of focus to have, like focusing on Kant's ethics or Aristotle's metaphysics or something like that. But for one thing, physics has changed a lot in the last 2 centuries, as has mathematics, particularly the mathematics Hegel is most focused on, the foundations of the calculus. And for another, Hegel's philosophy of nature seems at first quite unpromising as anything other than a target of purely antiquarian interest, given its reputation as a particularly derivative and maybe even degenerate form of romantic Naturphilosophie, probably hostile to and uncomprehending of the habitus and achievements of the natural sciences. And it's not just the Karl Poppers and the Neil deGrasse Tysons of the world who think this. For the past 200 years, the Hegelians themselves have been trying, by and large, to pretend that his philosophy of nature and his philosophy of physics in particular doesn't exist or can be excised from his system and done without. So why not just trust them on this and spend one's Hegel time on the phenomenology or on his political philosophy, or even his philosophy of history? Well, maybe some people just happen to really like Hegel and also really like physics and want to bring their passions together, and I guess that's fair enough. But I, for my part, have no particular passion or aptitude for physics or math, and yet here we are. So why? In the current context of the MCT, it may help for me to explain that I started out as a comp lit major with a strong proclivity for theory, specifically for deconstruction, which soon had me trying to get a handle on the three H's, Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger. I was drawn in no particular direction among them until I read a letter Paul de Man wrote in June of 1955 from Paris, reporting on the intellectual scene there, and noting the high stature of the, quote, Hegel specialists from the 30s, by whom he meant Hippolyte, Kojève, and Jeanval. He then writes of the younger generation saying, quote, "The defenders of Descartes and Kant are fighting a lonely battle against the terrifying skill with which the advanced students handle Hegelian dialectic, as if it were the table of two." You will understand that when I read there was something called handling Hegelian dialectic that one could learn to do with such skill that one might terrify Paul de Man. I was very intrigued. Around the same time, I had my first experience of the kind of writing feedback I could expect from philosophy professors, an experience that offered me much more on the masochistic side of things than what I was getting at the time from my literature professors. So off I went to graduate school in philosophy, and having not majored in philosophy, I went to a kind of remedial terminal MA program, which I chose because they let me in and gave me money, not because I knew what I was about or what they were about. I was so poorly informed that when I took a philosophy of language class there in my first year, I was genuinely shocked and surprised to discover that neither Saussure nor Derrida was on the reading list. My fellow grad students, Kevin included, had heard of all kinds of people and things I had never encountered. Who, pray tell, is this Quine person? Right? And what exactly is a Frege? Why am I being asked about something called twin Earth? And they seemed pretty sure that my three H's, along with anyone who took them seriously, was on an obviously wrong track. But why? Why did they, how could they think such a thing? Well, the natural answer is because they were haters. Or to put things more context appropriately, maybe because they had established a reaction formation against their own critical, negating Dionysiac death drive, a formation manifested in a positivism that transformed that drive into a set of rigid and fastidious Apollonian rules of argument and prose composition. This natural answer is probably true, and anyway, it's all good. Hateration is an important moment in the dialectic and is not the exclusive privilege of this or that position. But the more I lowered my guard against what I was encountering there and came to appreciate the power and depth achieved by some of the thinkers in the mainstream of Anglophone philosophy, the more I learned about this tradition's foci and tropes and concerns, the more I looked to see what the interpretive tradition, and that's the term I prefer for the other tradition, that's a term I borrow from your own Richard Schacht. I think it works a little better than continental. But the more I looked to see what the interpretive tradition had to say about these foci and concerns, the more I became convinced that the interpretive tradition routinely missed the chance to engage seriously, to engage what I might call justly, with the specific group of disciplines that has so often been the intense focus of and context for a lot of philosophy, namely the exact sciences, exemplified by math and physics. What ultimately seems so odd, I think, about the interpretive tradition, about theory to many mainstream philosophers, is just this distance and alienation between it and the exact sciences. And there are a lot of qualifiers to put in here, right? Exact sciences matters, right? Husserl is a mathematician. There's a long tradition of engagement with the life sciences in the 20th century in France in particular. Heidegger was an advanced physics student before he switched to philosophy, so there are a lot of caveats here. But I still think, it works. Anyway, by engaging justly, and I could perhaps otherwise here say engaging cooperatively, as I'll try to make clear a little bit later on. I mean engaging the exact sciences in terms that could be recognized by their practitioners and students as doing justice not only to their results and the downstream effects of those results, but to their internal processes, their struggles and their self-understanding and their self-image. So, a couple of side points. I mean, one, there is sometimes good reason not to do justice to the objects of one's critique. Right? We can talk about that a little bit later if you want. And then, to say that the interpretive tradition doesn't engage justly with these sciences is different from saying that it abuses or distorts them, right? I have nothing but impatience and scorn for things like the Sokol affair. Just to clarify. Philosophers, critics, and theorists in the interpretive tradition had, it seemed to me then, rather well earned their reputation of being disinclined to engage justly in this sense with the exact sciences, preferring instead to sort of keep their distance and remain aloof. And even though at the time I wasn't terribly well informed as to whether this was actually the case, it was more like a feeling. It now, years later, still seems to me like a pretty fair judgment. Yet even if we accept that the interpretive tradition has not grappled much directly and justly with the exact sciences, has not produced from out of its own resources a robust and active discourse in or around math and physics commensurate with that found in the Anglophone tradition and in German and French and Italian, kind of academic philosophy, we might still reasonably ask whether that tradition is really obligated to engage justly with them. It's hard to know if it makes sense to talk about a tradition or an approach being obligated to do anything at all. And I'm not so keen on thinking of individual philosophers or theorists or critics as being obligated to confront this or that argument or claim. The moralism of such an idea alone, turns me away from it. But then there's also the fact that a certain sort of critique really only operates through refusal. Right? Whether that refusal is open and explicit or takes the form of pretending as though its possible object doesn't even exist. Right? And this is actually what characterizes the Hegelian critique of Hegel's own philosophy of nature for the last 200 years. Their version of criticism of it is just, we're going to pretend like it's not there. This is a little bit, I think Deleuze says somewhere that he's trying to write philosophy as though Hegel had never existed. Right? So this is the other. This is at least, I don't know, respected. It's a known way of operating anyway. It might be that, refusing to devote much time or energy to the exact sciences at all might be the best way to parry, their sometimes excessive demands for our deference and praise. Fair enough. But these demands aren't going to go anywhere, and the exact sciences themselves aren't going to interrogate their place in our culture's thinking and other practices just because theory gives them the silent treatment. So just as these sciences themselves are not monoliths, so too the positions they have, both in their determinate existent form and content and in their role as ideological vehicles, in nearly every single one of our practices, institutions, discourses, bodies of knowledge, etc., are varied and variable, but they are always powerful, either actually or potentially. Given the reality of their power in all of its myriad aspects, what sort of philosophy or theory worthy of the name would we have if all we had were one incapable of or unwilling to directly, to justly engage with them? And if we approach them from outside, that is, if we forego this kind of engagement and try to critique them in some other way, the resulting theory or critique or interpretation of them would seem to have little promise of success, no matter how we construe success here. For as exact sciences, they enjoy a peculiar sort of autonomy in relation to the non-quantitative, non-formal, concrete conceptuality characteristic of critique. Thus, when critique approaches them, the exact sciences turn toward it with a kind of cleft look. The numbers, as innocent, kind of on the far side, right? And on the near side, they're frequently less innocent, right? Uses and aims to which the numbers are being put, right? Faced with this cleft look, one can criticize concepts of epistemic authority, one can show that the autonomy of the exact sciences is contradicted in their concrete existence by the simple fact of their enmeshment in this or that mode of production, this or that political institution or structure, this or that ideological apparatus. One can argue that concepts of universality, objectivity, and invariant truth central to the science's self-understanding are problematic in this or that way. But in doing so, one seems always only to have grasped a hold of something on the near side of the cleft, something extrinsic to the mathematically ordered and articulated relations among pure and physical quantities, allegedly making up the exact sciences themselves. Themselves. Thus, the interpretive tradition may want to grapple with the exact sciences on the interpretive tradition's own turf, but that is not the locus on the far side of the cleft in which these sciences root themselves and from which they project their power and authority. To grapple with the exact sciences at the root of their projected power is to grapple with them on their own turf, to approach them justly, in my sense, to do them justice. It is to approach them along the old path of the characteristically Hegelian method, internal critique. So then my graduate student thought was, I like Hegel because I am an intellectual masochist, and furthermore, really want to learn how to handle the dialectic with terrifying skill. I think the interpretive tradition, of which Hegel is a major figure, ought at least be capable of eliciting an internal critique of the natural sciences, the exact sciences. And look, it turns out that Hegel has a whole book called The Philosophy of Nature, the first third of which is dedicated to mechanics, along with a logic in which there are hundreds of pages devoted to math. So what's up with all that? I said to myself. So that's where we are. Well, here's what's up with all that. Hegel does indeed elicit an internal critique of the exact sciences. Not only that, he seems himself to have attached great significance to his efforts to do so. These sciences are the topic of his dissertation on the orbits of the planets. Some sort of philosophy of nature is a major part of all three of the pre-phenomenology of spirit system drafts that we have. The exact sciences are discussed in many places in the phenomenology, most prominently in the sections on force in the understanding and observing reason. Mechanics, and especially mathematics, and most especially differential calculus in its application to mechanics, are treated in many places in the logic, sometimes at very great length. The exact sciences are the concern of about half the material in the philosophy of nature, and that book constitutes the literal center of Hegel's three-part system. And during his years in Berlin, Hegel lectured on the philosophy of nature as frequently as he did on any other topic. So, there's something there. But what makes these Hegelian treatments count as eliciting from the exact sciences themselves internal critique? Well, let's start with the word, the noun, in my view, critique. I mean it as Hegel used it in the strict Kantian sense. In this sense, when I offer a critique of X, I do not attack, overthrow, destroy, or otherwise get the better of X in some general and total way. Hegel calls that sort of thing refutation and abstract negation. Rather, when I offer a critique of X, I determine the limits of X's valid deployment or domain. And thus I also show that there is some domain in which X is in fact valid. Thus for Kant, and bracketing for the moment the subjective sense of the genitive, the critique of pure reason is not an attack on or refutation of pure reason, but a determination of the limits of pure reason's legitimate, coherent operation. Namely, pure reason does not determine possible objects of experience, but it does organize experience into the systematic form of a science, and it does determine the free will. Drawing on this Kantian sense of critique, Hegel calls his objective logic, which makes up the first two-thirds of his logic, the, quote, true critique of the categories. And insofar as this philosophy of nature is articulated through that objective logic, and it too is a critique no longer of the categories of logic or metaphysics or ontology, but of the categories of mechanics. But this means that the philosophy of nature, as internal critique of mechanics, does not refute or attack mechanics, but rather exhibits its limits. Unlike the abstract negation of refutation, the negation involved in critique is what Hegel calls determinate negation. And in each case, specific form in which a determinate content is negated. Moreover, and now unbracketing the subjective genitive of the phrase critique of X, the determinate negation operative in internal critique is only ever operated by X itself. That is, it is only ever internal. As for Kant, pure reason itself enacts and does not merely undergo its critique. Right? The thing that performs the critique of pure reason is the same thing as the thing that gets critiqued. And that's Hegel takes that as the model. The Hegelian critique of the nature known by the exact sciences must therefore be an internal critique, not only in the somewhat vague, ordinary sense in which such a critique operates with the premises or assumptions of those sciences themselves or of its target, rather than by bringing in concerns, premises, or assumptions extrinsic to them. It must also be an internal critique in the more specific sense that it does not operate autonomously, but only elicits the critique cooperatively. The logic of the exact sciences itself, rather than their premises taken up in some other logic, must draw their limits around them in the course of that logic's normal and valid operation in its domain. But now what does this mean for the logic of the exact sciences to draw their limits around them? Hegel himself likes to insist that to draw a limit is to be already on the other side of that limit. That is to be on both sides at once. So how can mechanics produce its autocritique without also being more than mechanics, without going beyond itself? Well, in a sense, for Hegel, each of the stages of the philosophy of nature, mechanics, what he calls physics, we'd probably call it chemistry, and organics, does go beyond itself, but only precisely as much beyond itself as is required for the delimitation to happen, at which point that very beyond shows itself to be the content of the next stage, in relation to which the first stage is not something outside it, but something incorporated into it. And this is what's called sublation. So how this works will become easier to see if I stop speaking in generalities. But although he's at home right now with COVID, I'm going to keep my promise to John Bernard not to throw up a bunch of slides with like differential equations and orbital paths on them and stuff. And instead, I'm going to split the difference between generalization and excessive detail. And sketch a connected series of points that Hegel makes from the logic to the philosophy of nature, and just assert that you have to trust me that I'm right on the details, although we can talk about it later if you want. So, specifics. So Hegel's logic more or less begins with the thought that to be is never just to be, full stop, right? But always to be in some way or other, right? Which at the same time implies not being in yet some other way, right? To be one way is, if that means anything at all, it means not being at least something else. So he then moves on from this thought with the idea that perhaps there's some most basic way to be, such that all other ways of being are derivative of or reducible to that most basic way. His first proposal is that all being in some way or another is what he, following the tradition, calls being a quality, being determinate by being a simple what or how. He eventually comes to the conclusion, by following out the internal logic of the internal critique of the logic of quality, that if qualitative determination were the only kind of determination, if it in fact were this thing he's ostensibly looking for in the logic, namely the most basic way of being, so that if qualitative determination were that, there just wouldn't actually be any determination at all. But this conclusion arises only because the internal critique of quality ends up generating, through determinate negation, the very non-qualitative, more precisely quantitative, determination it turns out to depend on, right? And it thereby delimits itself in the way that I was talking about before. Hegel's next step then is to ask whether quantity, that is being insofar as it's always a being how much or how many, right, could function as the most basic determinacy. So that's the next, this is the whole pattern of the logic. Suggest something new as the basic determinacy and then find out it doesn't work. But he soon comes to see, this time through the internal critique of the logic of quantity, that the categories of quantity are in turn dependent upon and delimit themselves by sort of emptying themselves into quality. So this is an awkward situation. The one ends up in the other and vice versa. From it, however, Hegel does not infer that the categories of quantity and quality are hopelessly confused, but rather that they are abstractions from a single encompassing unity. They come as a package, so to speak, so that all quality is some quantity of that quality, and all quantity is a quantity of some determinate quality. So to be a how much is to be how much of something or other, and to be a something or other is to be that to some degree or other. Hegel's name for this package, this concrete unity of quality and quantity in relation to which each is only an abstraction, is what he calls measure. And in this, he develops his theory of physical quantities. Things like length and time, and et cetera. Although somewhat abstractly. All right. So much for that bit of the logic. Now, when it comes in the philosophy of nature to the examination of the laws of matter and motion in mechanics, it turns out that we start our consideration there with the proposal that nature is first and foremost quantitative. What basic qualitative determinations there are in nature, right? And what basic qualitative determinations there are, negation relations through which time and space are articulated, for instance, are themselves only concretely determinate through quantitative determinacy. They are quantities, they are numbers of some kind. In other words, Hegel begins the philosophy of nature with a mathematized, quantified view of the world. And to this extent, Heidegger is entirely correct in his attack on this aspect of the philosophy of nature. I mean, he's right about what Hegel's doing. Whether that is something that should be attacked is a separate matter. But that is what he's doing. Okay. What the internal critique of this quantified nature amounts to, then, is a detailed demonstration that although the concepts and laws of mechanics articulating quantified material nature make up a logically related totality, they can do so only by drawing on varieties of determination and differentiation that are not themselves mechanical determinations or differentiations. More specifically, mechanics, as reconstructed by Hegel, does not differentiate between qualitatively distinct kinds of matter, but only has a concept of matter in general, differentiating between distinct material bodies, something it has to do because its laws are laws about the relations of those bodies, right, purely quantitatively. But as Hegel argues in detail through his analysis of those laws and their concepts, mechanics cannot on its own deliver a unique differentiation of material bodies. If all it has to rely on are its own quantifying resources, then it can't actually tell you which the bodies are. It can give you an infinite number of equally acceptable models, and it cannot help you choose. And thus, it has, because in order to operate any of those models, it has to make some sort of choice about which the bodies are, but it can't do that in its own terms. Right? It turns out that it's dependent on another view of matter that is not the mechanical view of matter, a view according to which matter, in fact, does differ qualitatively and not just quantitatively. But that's the view of the next section of the philosophy of nature, physics. So Hegel's conclusion here in the philosophy of nature about mechanics is no different in general outline from his conclusion in the logic about quantity, quality, and measure. The dependence of mechanics on non-mechanical differentiation does not invalidate mechanics, but it shows that it has a limit. And in demonstrating the dependence of mechanics on this other kind of determination of nature, right, chemistry or physics, right, qualitative nature, Hegel does not show that mechanics is defective, but shows rather that it belongs together with, comes as a package with chemistry, even though it operates in abstraction from that. Right? So to be doing physics is to be always abstracting from something else, to be doing mechanics. So what is refuted, if anything, is thus not mechanics, but the claim of mechanics to autonomy and to independent fundamentality. But that turns out to be a claim that mechanics itself, if the internal critique is right, on its own terms, could not possibly be making, given its own self-delimitation, its autocritique. It turns out to be instead the ventriloquism of a mechanistic ideology at odds with its own eidos. So it turns out that you have to be misinterpreting mechanics to make the claim that it's autonomous and fundamental in that way. The physical realm, in its turn, of course, operates this autocritique upon itself, with the result that the qualitative-quantitative determinacy of physical nature, of chemistry, is impossible unless nature itself is also essentially organic, according to Hegel, a totality of living individuals, or, to put it more mildly maybe, unless the conceptual space in which physics is articulated also includes concepts of the living. People are sometimes uncomfortable with the idea that the universe has to have living things in it, so I'll just say it has to have space for them. But I think Hegel thinks they have to be there. A universe in which there's no place for the living is therefore unintelligible on Hegel's view. Right? Far from life being reducible to a chemical or mechanical base, right, the nature delivered to us by mechanics and physics is only complete when taken up into a context that includes biology. And finally, at the end of the philosophy of nature, Hegel argues that natural life depends on a determinacy, more precisely a variety of unity, which, however, is not available within nature as a natural object, because it is not itself a natural thing, not the unity of a naturally existing individual. This is the unity of the Gattung, of the species. Right? Keep this in mind for the Marx lecture next week. It's important, or at least could be. Nature, as the realm of the living, is necessarily organized on a number of axes by this structure of unity. But because this unity is not itself the unity of any existent natural individual, there is no natural individual that's just the species running around, right? It cannot be understood as unity within nature. And in the move that takes him from the realm of nature to the realm of spirit, Hegel tells us that although the species unity has no existence as a natural thing, it does have its Dasein, its existence, in a not quite natural existence, namely Geist, or spirit. And thus we are in the philosophy of spirit. Okay. The critique of the exact sciences, or perhaps said in a way much more kind of consonant with Hegel's conclusion, the autocritique of the conception of being and nature advanced by or revealed in the natural sciences. Thus leads from the critique of mechanics to the establishment and autocritique of the physical, and then the organic conceptions of nature, each of which counts as the enclosing and grounding whole in relation to which its predecessor appears as an abstraction. These are each instances of, the famous sublation, Aufhebung, which thus turns out to be another name for the process of genuinely internal critique. And critique, as such autocritique, turns out to be the rigorous logic of the thing itself, not something operated from outside, not something avoidable, except by self-deception, by self-ideologizing. The exact sciences in this picture assert autonomy, but also relativize that autonomy, for that autonomy turns out to have as its price the acceptance of a given distinction of which they can make no sense on their own terms. There is, of course, much to say about all this and about all that it may imply, but for present purposes, what matters here is that Hegel, a major, possibly founding figure of the modern critical tradition, does attempt to elicit from the exact sciences, through detailed study of their own content and form, their autocritique, which itself exhibits their lack of autonomy at the conceptual level, eventually leading to their dependence on a living nature, and then in turn, onto a totality of existence that involves mindedness or Geist. Okay. How am I doing on time? What does that mean? Right. I've been going for 55 minutes. That doesn't seem right. Okay. Well, I'm 2/3 through. Is that okay? I'll breathe easy. I think I'm good. All right, cool. All right. So anyway, let me turn now to an account of the of the currently dominant mode of Hegel interpretation, at least in English and German language context. All right. So this is non-metaphysical Hegel, although they're not calling it that anymore. They used to call it that. All right. I'm going to pretend they're still calling it that because it's on the slide. The mode I have in mind is probably most closely associated with the name of Robert Pippin up in Chicago, and is usually classified as a variety of non-metaphysical interpretation of Hegel. Now, look, the very idea of a non-metaphysical Hegel tends to prompt a lot of eye-rolling, right? Next, you'll be telling us about non-epistemological Descartes, or like Hume, the Christian apologist. But the label is to be taken with a grain of salt. It's really a kind of overreaction to previous interpretations of Hegel. But the claim made by such interpretations, and Pippin's is not in any way the only one, there are quite a wide variety of them, is that if Hegel is doing metaphysics, it isn't like the metaphysics done up until Kant. Right? Thus, his Hegel is also still is a strongly post-Kantian Hegel, one who's to be understood wherever possible as developing and extending a program originally Kantian in inspiration, but so transformed by Hegel's criticisms of Kant as to be no longer Kantian really, but instead Hegelian. Now, Pippin is not just a Hegel-inspired thinker. He's not like, he doesn't relate to Hegel the way that like Adorno or Derrida or Charles Taylor or Catherine Malibu does. Right? But through and through, he's really a Hegel scholar. So this is a position in like Hegel, scholarship. I don't mean that, like, you know, that's not necessarily a merit or a demerit, but anyway. Despite a growing output of books on other figures and topics, the core and bulk of Pippin's work is commentary upon an argument about the right way to interpret Hegel, and that's the case for this whole, you know, field of non-metaphysical interpretations. And, you know, his approach, beginning with his 1989 Hegel's Idealism, has had an enormous influence on this state of play. However, unlike most Hegel scholars, Pippin provided, just a year after that book, in a book called Modernism as a Philosophical Problem, a larger philosophical cultural account in terms of which he wants his interpretive approach to Hegel to be understood. Although, interestingly enough, this larger account is rarely, if ever, brought into debates around interpretations of Hegel, even around Pippin's own. That's a topic for another day. Why doesn't contemporary Hegel scholarship worry about the larger context in which it's operating? Why doesn't it ever even talk about that? At least this Anglophone scholarship, it's quite odd. Anyway, according to that larger account, I'm going to talk about it. Hegel is the decisive and indeed the fundamentally adequate and thus authoritative philosopher of European modernity. He knows what that modernity is, or at least, you know, that's the idea. He knows that it is upon him and his contemporaries. He recognizes the problems it has made for itself, social, religious, artistic, political, ethical, above all, for Hegel, philosophico-theoretical problems. And he is thoroughly familiar with the resources it has at its disposal for solving and or reformulating those problems. Hegel knows which achievements modernity and the modern subject are unwilling to surrender, either consciously or unconsciously. For instance, individualism, autonomy, inwardness, but also outward recognition, some kind of political self-determination. These are kind of non-negotiable, right, commitments of modern subjectivity. And he knows which practices and institutions have been and continue to be vital to the self-understanding and self-examination of communities of such subjects, right? Practices of religious self-understanding, aesthetic, artistic self-understanding, political self-determination and self-knowing, etc. He knows as well the seductive appeal of earlier forms of authority when their collapse and failure has been forgotten and their apparent strengths reappear in the guise of nostalgic memory, as well as the appeal of abandoning modernity's achievements, not in the name of a glorified past, but just to be rid of the demands those achievements make on us. Right? It's not easy being a modern subject, and the conflicts and tensions that they've left us with. So Hegel knows all this, according to this picture of him as the philosopher of modernity. He knows the unique power of philosophy to gather it all up, and wields that power to present not a fixed and final picture of modern life rightly lived, but a way of thinking of ourselves and the task of living in and dealing with modernity that is sufficiently capacious and agile to wrangle it all into a sensible, intelligible order, precisely without settling all extant matters of dispute. It's a little bit of a view, I mean, Hegel's a critique of liberalism, but it's a little bit of a view of Hegel as, in another sense, the ultimate liberal, right? What he's interested in setting up is a context within which we can continue to fight, not a context in which the fights are put, are ended. Where was I? The Hegelian system on this view is rather more a context within which the disputes can be articulated and managed than it is a proposal on the ground as to the solution of each and every problem. Of course, it offers a number of concrete solutions. For instance, relatively definite proposals from Hegel as to the institutional structures of civil society and the state. But even these are constructed so as to be open to varieties of dispute and change, at least as serious as the disputes that they are meant to resolve. So according to this view of things, then, the post-Hegelian criticisms of European modernity, according to which it does not have within itself the resources to respond to its own problems, according to which it's fatally flawed, according to which its central conceptions of subjectivity, autonomy, history, normativity, knowledge, universalism, individuality, and so on, are ultimately incoherent and unsustainable, these positions, from this reading of Hegel, must be understood at the deepest level as simple misunderstandings. Misunderstandings of modernity itself, and thus misunderstandings of the self-understanding of modernity. That is the Hegelian understanding of modernity, and this will be familiar to you from any interactions you've had with the kind of Hegelian who likes to respond to any criticism by finding the place in Hegel where he already talked about it. I'm not usually one of those guys, but sometimes the temptation overcomes me. Anyway, they may have their merits, this Hegelian will tell you. Marx may have been, as a matter of fact, in a better position to grasp the realities of factory labor and urban life, and may thus have something to offer in thinking through the precise ways in which the alienation and exploitation of the laboring classes both comes about and can be addressed. Cézanne or Henry James may have been, in fact, able to arrive at an aesthetic practice that extended the power of the arts to contribute to our self-understanding beyond the point at which they had arrived in Prussia in 1820, and so on. But the pretense that they, or Nietzsche, or Simone Weil, or Heidegger, or Beauvoir, or Sartre, or Arendt, or Foucault, or Said, or Deleuze, or Fanon, or Irigaray, or Derrida, or Butler, right? Or whoever, could provide a radical critique that would force modernity to confess its own incoherence and inadequacy, that's just a pretense. And its status as a pretense is to be shown by demonstrating that in each case the basic argument misconstrues the conceptual commitments of modernity when those commitments are understood properly. Understood, that is, as Hegel would have us understand them. The alleged dead end of theory of postmodernism, the need to subjectivate, to develop a discourse, to desubjectivate, to develop a discourse, or better still, an écriture, capable of opening up fissures in the totalizing walls of metaphysics, all of this turns out to be, at bottom, a matter of misreading Hegel, according to this view. Now, this is already going to be, catnip for your average Hegel cat. But what is particularly powerful and appealing about this larger account from the perspective of Hegel scholarship, and what made it, I think, quite surprising in the context in which it was first advanced, was Pippin's claim that we could vindicate this account by, and could only vindicate it by, working through in detail the ins and outs of Hegel's speculative thought, beginning not with his conception of history or his theory of the state, but with his transformative appropriation of Kant's transcendental philosophy, right? First and foremost, by reading the transcendental deduction correctly. By reading the transcendental deduction correctly, we could defend modernity against all of its critics since 1820, basically. This is an intriguing idea. If we begin there, Pippin argues, we can see that what has the look of a narrow dispute about the nature of the spatiotemporal and categorical ordering of experience is in fact also a dispute about what it is to be a concept-mongering creature at all, and thus what it is to be the sort of thing that can be what it is only by taking itself to be the sort of thing it is, where the sort of thing it is not a substance, hence non-metaphysical, or a descriptively available fact about a class of entities, but a normative status, a status held by being a recognized and recognizing participant in a better or worse defined historical community, always in the process of bringing itself about precisely through its ongoing struggles for self-understanding and self-actualization. Now, as may or may not be apparent from the description I just gave, such a view leaves little room, or seemed to Pippin himself to leave little room, in the self-conception of the modern individual for the sort of descriptively available facts that are the bread and butter of the natural and maybe even also the social sciences. If we are what we are by taking ourselves to be such, no matter how complex the story of such taking and such being turns out to be, institutionally, historically, pragmatically, right, et cetera, then if natural facts about us and our world are to play any role in our being, that sort of thing, right, they can only play such a role by being given that role by us in our self-understanding. There could be no brute facts that had authority for us unless we gave them that authority. We could, of course, end up doing so, perhaps by calling them brute facts and then agreeing that one cannot, after all, argue about the brute facts. Right? But in such case, it obviously wouldn't be the brute factuality itself, but our decision to give certain things the status of brute factuality that would be the source of their authority in our self-conception. So this aspect of Pippin's specific brand of non-metaphysical Hegel interpretation is indicated nicely by the title of an essay he wrote in response to John McDowell, whose work, partially building on Pippin's Hegel interpretation, leans away from Pippin's quasi-transcendental line and toward the idea that to be the kind of subjects we are in the sorts of communities we belong to, with the sorts of histories we and they have, is to be not just something that takes itself some way, but to be a certain kind of animal. In Charles Taylor's phrase, a self-interpreting animal. According to McDowell, we accommodate Hegelian self-understanding to our naturalness in what he calls a relaxed Aristotelian naturalism. This is opposed to like a reductive scientistic naturalism. By grasping our concept-mongering, irreducibly norm-guided practices, not as involving a distancing and negating break from the natural facts of our animality, a break Pippin seems to conceive as sort of always already accomplished, right? But as simply the actualization of the life proper to the kind of animal we are. The human is a rational animal in the sense that the human's animality itself is permeated by rationality, such that the brute natural facts about us are brute natural facts about a rational animal, about rational life, not a set of facts distinct from Geist or a spirit conceived then as simply tacked on to some indifferent natural base. Right? To live the life of such an animal is just to be acculturated into conceptual norm-guided practices. No other life is, properly speaking, a human life. The title of Pippin's essay responding to this line of criticism is Leaving Nature Behind. Now, the idea of leaving nature behind, in other words, his doubling down on the fact that it's not about being an animal, it's about interpreting yourself. And if animality matters, it's only because we put it in the interpretation. Now, the idea of leaving nature behind certainly has much to support it in Hegel's text. He talks this way a lot. But then some readers of Hegel, no doubt inspired at least in part by McDowell, noticed that for Hegel, the peculiar self-constituting self-relation characteristic of spirit, of Geist, is quite explicitly modeled on the self-relation of the living creature as such, and most clearly exemplified precisely in animal life, in Hegel, right? So that if you read the end of the Philosophy of Nature, what you get is an account of something that at the animal level has pretty much the same self-relation that's supposed to be manifested exclusively in spirit through this self-interpreting activity. There are a lot of fascinating details here, but the basic idea is that Hegel's reworking of the Kantian conception of purposiveness from the Third Critique in the form of what Hegel calls inner purposiveness lets us understand the making myself what I am by taking myself to be such structure of subjectivity as already operative in non-human animals, including non-human animals one might not be terribly inclined to credit with reasoning and consciousness, right? So we're not talking about something that's like only in the, great apes or something like that. And so what began as a more or less resolutely Kantian, if only half-heartedly transcendental, understanding of Hegelian subjectivity in Pippin's, landscape establishing work, has been moving in the literature toward a more naturalist reading on which our animality is so far from being something we have to leave behind to actualize ourselves that such actualization is instead dependent on animal life itself. All right. So, with this move from spirit to animality and the debates to which it has given rise, the field of non-metaphysical Hegel interpretations has, as it were, kind of backed itself into nature, systematically speaking. Advocates of the idea of spirit or Geist as essentially allied to the natural, to the naturally living have come to see the importance of making sense of Hegel's philosophy of nature. But by backing into nature, into life in this way from spirit, they get things precisely backwards. They don't explain how life is unintelligible or impossible without spirit, but rather they attempt to make spirit intelligible by appeal to life. In other words, this is to get it systematically reversed for Hegel. And what's more, even if they succeed, they only push the problem they were trying to address back a further step. They are then faced with the difficulty of explaining not how the self-relation of spirit arises out of nature, but how the self-relation of the living animal arises out of the non-living realm of physics and chemistry. But of course, it doesn't arise at all, or if it does, that isn't the story Hegel's trying to tell. He's telling us about the conceptual dependencies, and according to that story, just as life is unintelligible without spirit, the physical is unintelligible without life. It exhibits its dependency on the concept of the organic in its autocritique. Right? So the point I'm trying to make is one about the correct order of argument and order of dependency. More importantly, the idea that there is simply a kind of animal that we are, and that such an animal is one who is rational and wields concepts, Either involves a conception of animality that is meant to run in parallel with, but remain independent of and even indifferent to whatever happens in biology, or it requires reconciliation with the biological concept. The non-metaphysical, relaxed Aristotelian naturalism approach involves the former parallelism, but Hegel's involves the second, the reconciliation. This is the point of the autocritique of the sciences and of biological science in particular, to show that the very conceptuality of the nature revealed in biological science requires the concept of mind, and thus eventually of full-blown human rationality, just as the very conceptuality of the nature revealed in mechanics requires the physico-chemical concept of qualitatively distinct kinds of matter. In the end, it seems to me that the avoidance of the question of the adequacy of the pictures of nature presented by the natural sciences, not their adequacy in terms of this or that claim, but their internal self-adequacy in terms of the general sorts of pictures they are, and their conceptual dependency relations on other pictures, on other discourses, on other things they demand but cannot themselves countenance. Avoiding this is just not sustainable, which I think both versions of the non-metaphysical reading do. It is not enough simply to say, this is part of being the kind of animal we are, when the natural sciences, or rather, at least ideologists claiming the mantle of those scientists, want to tell us what it is to be the kind of animal we are, and they don't want to talk about reasons when they do that. I mean, they want to talk about reasons for what they're saying, but that's not quite the same. These discourses do not peacefully coexist without conflict and without being appropriated by yet other discourses for other ends. Nothing in this area is allowed to remain settled by simply saying, well, it's sort of, I should be allowed two concepts of the animal. It doesn't work that way, right? At least if you want that, you have to work for it. A philosophy, a critique that does not trust itself to confront and understand the natural sciences in all their non-monolithic, quasi-chaotic productivity, self-contradiction, empirical and explanatory power, and occasional blindness to their own nature, cannot hope to resist their ideological appropriation. It can only play into the hands of a third discourse that wants to make the sciences autonomous, not of capital and political power, which they feel no need to be liberated from, except in the sense of, changing the balance of regulatory capture at the margins, but of humanistic self-understanding, right? Is such an understanding the same as criticism in theory? I don't know, I've been hanging out with the philosophers too long to know. What I do know is that the advantage, put in Hegelian terms, that humanistic self-understanding and critique, in other words, Hegelian, this idea of trying to understand ourselves through critique, is that they do not need to be, and indeed cannot be, autonomous from anything under, or for that matter, above and beyond the sun. Right? This is the dialectical flip side, I want to say, of Hegel's claim for the supremacy of philosophy and for the systematic totalizing of philosophy as the ultimate science. So what I mean to affirm here is the Hegelian commitment to totalization. I think this is a good thing. Not in its subjugating, but in its liberating guise. Philosophy as a self-understanding critique has the task of seeing itself as non-autonomous with respect to each and every other domain, as cooperative, not as operating independently, but only as operating along with them, eliciting rather than operating critique upon them. As Hegel puts it, philosophy seeks everywhere to be bei sich, alongside itself or with itself. This idea is too often understood as Hegel saying to all other discourses the words that Seneca commends, that the Stoic used to reply in the face of life's catastrophes. Those are, I knew it. But it should be understood instead, Hegelian totalizing should be understood instead as saying something like, we are in this together, let's get to work. Thanks.